Check it. School choice. It's a hot topic right now in my home state of California, and school choice has been adopted by about 20 states so far in the United States. But with the upcoming recall election in California, one of the leading candidates to replace Gavin Newsom is Larry Elder. Larry Elder is a huge proponent of school choice. He argues that school choice and the educational dollars should follow students. Students should not follow the educational dollars. Now, what's ironic about the current educational system in the United States is we often like to look to Europe's socialized education system as a way to model our system after theirs. Now, Neal McCluskey, who is the director of educational freedom at the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, actually tells us something a little bit different. This is part one of a three-part series on school choice.
So along those lines, let me tell you that right now, while my home state is California and my home is in Orange County, I currently am in the Czech Republic visiting with family right now. And so a conversation that my wife and I always have about education is it's absolutely reversed in the Czech Republic specifically. And maybe this is something that's new to you, or this is something that you only know a little bit about, but I'd like to maybe use this as an exercise here. Over here, because of socialized education, the public school education system is looked at more highly than going to a private school. Why do you think that is backwards in the Czech Republic versus what is happening in the United States?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first problem is that almost every country adopted at one point a system similar to ours, where government provided the schools. And often that meant those schools were better funded. They became sort of the norm, where if you went to a private school, people would sort of think, well, there's something a little weird about you. If you think about US history, although I should say, for much of US history, really up through the 1830s, when you have Horace Mann and the beginning of the common school movement, but education was private, but a lot of it wasn't based in formal schooling. It was apprenticeships and things like that. So you establish this new model, that's the norm. And one of the problems is the people who don't follow that model are thought of as sort of odd. And the group that was least likely to follow that model, to reject it, was Roman Catholics. Because public schools in this country, for much of their history, many of the public schools, it certainly varied from district to district, but were de facto Protestant institutions, because the assumption was a good American is Protestant. There were disagreements among Protestants about what exactly that meant. But so it was Catholics, sort of the outsiders, who really wanted these private schools, because those were schools that could teach things that didn't insult their kids and didn't indoctrinate them in things they thought were wrong. And so you would think of people on choosing that as sort of on the margins. And if you think that, then you think, well, okay, there's more prestige in going to the public schools because the private schoolers are kind of strange. But what we see in much of Europe, and I don't know whether it was the case in the Czech Republic, but if you go to places like the Netherlands or even France, or you go to many Canadian provinces, there is school choice, much more prevalent in those places than there are in the United States. And much of that was driven, again, by religion. So interestingly, so you used to have something called the United Netherlands, which was the Netherlands and Belgium. And Belgium was is arguably the first country that sort of split off for independence because of schooling. They were more Catholic than the rest of the Netherlands, and they didn't like having public schools imposed on them that were sort of Protestant or not religious, depending who's in charge. And one of the reasons they broke off is they said, we want to control what our kids learn. Eventually, the Netherlands has lots of back and forth about, well, do you have just Protestant public schools, non-sectarian public schools, Catholic public schools? And they moved to a system of very wide school choice, where today in the Netherlands, if it's, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like if you can get 20 families together that say, hey, we want a Montessori school, and there isn't one within a certain distance of us, government says, here's money, start a Montessori school.
That's cool.
And so many countries have adopted more school choice than we have. And the norm is, at the very least, typically, if you want a Catholic education or Protestant education or non-sectarian education, we'll at least fund the schools where you can choose among those things. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that those schools have the most prestige. And something that happened in the United States was wealthy people always sort of many sought out private education because certain private schools did have prestige. Andover, Exeter, and you go in California, Harvard, Westlake, and places like that. And that's where they were always sending their kids for status. And so different places would have different developments, but a lot of places, including especially Europe, school choice is part of the fabric, in large part because they were trying to diffuse lots of religious conflicts, which of course racked Europe for much of its history.
Now, that was a historical lesson there, Neal, and I thank you for that. That was really interesting, actually, to learn about the differences between Belgium and, well, the United Netherlands, and then the split off, and the reason why. When was the last time you referenced that, sir? It seemed like you kind of lit up you kind of lit up pretty happily as you were talking about that.
Well, secret is, it's one thing important because most people don't know it. And I like to talk about it because people don't know it. People are usually shocked. They oppose school choice. And I think in the United States, many people tend to think, well, school choice is just one of those weird libertarian kind of cowboy things that, it would be kind of American, that you should just be a rugged individualist and do your own education. And they would think, well, that would never exist in someplace really sort of civilized like Europe. And actually, it's much more the norm in other countries than it is here. And people need to know that. And because I run something called the Public Schooling Battle Map, and it was created because there is sort of a mythology about public schools that we still see a lot today, which is that if we didn't have public schools, we'd be balkanized. We'd all be off in our own little groups, presumably both isolated and fighting, although I don't know why exactly those things would go together. And they say this public schools united us. And I think that history is actually wrong. And I think it's very clearly wrong. And what's interesting to sort of illustrate the problem is if you look in other countries, their solution to their fighting wasn't, we're going to just force everyone to be the same. They finally realized we can't do that. And the way we establish peace is through choice. And I think that is what we need to do in the United States. If we want peaceful coexistence within education, we should want choice.